heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is your host, Brian McClanahan, and this is episode 216, covering the week of May 4th through May 8th, 2020. Glad to have you back on the program. Very glad to be here. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at Abbeville Institute, like our Facebook page at Abbeville Institute, and of course, subscribe to our YouTube page at Abbeville Institute. You can find all those social media accounts at our webpage, abbevilleinstitute.org. While you're there, give us an email address. We'll give you a free ebook, Exploring the Southern Tradition. It's a great book. Even if you've already given us an email address, give us another one because you'll get the new ebook. So it's free of charge. You want it, so get it. We've also upgraded our donor portal, so if you want to donate to the Institute, it is tax deductible to the full extent of the law. If you want to help us explore what's true and valuable in the Southern tradition, if you like the podcast, the website, conferences, all the things we do, and we still have stuff going on, we have, of course, postponed our summer school, at least in person. We're talking about some other things, so we could see a summer school, just not necessarily in person. But if you like what we do, consider a tax-deductible donation to the Institute. It will help. You can donate monthly, annually, or a one-time gift. Just click on that support tab at abbevilleinstitute.org. You can help us that way. Also, click on that shop button under that support tab. You can get your Abbeville Institute apparel. It's high-quality embroidered stuff, so go on out there and get that as well. And always, please share our material around on social media. If you like it, let people know you like it. Rate our podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Get our free app. Download that as well. You get the Abbeville Institute on the go, so you can get the podcast, the lectures, all the cool stuff that we do here in pushing back and on the assault against the Southern tradition, but also a positive affirmation of the Southern tradition. That's something I think that people need to understand. What we try to do here, more than anything else, is have a positive affirmation of the Southern tradition and what it means for America today and why we should still pay attention to the Southern tradition. It's important. When you talk about modern politics, modern society, all of these things, the Southern tradition still has a voice that's often muzzled, but certainly there when it comes to the issues of the day. So this is why we do what we do at the Institute, and I think we're not just a bunch of cranky people that don't like what's being said about the South. I mean, that certainly we talk about criticisms of the South, or we're not just a bunch of people that sit around worrying about the war, though that is part of what we do. I mean, interpretation of the war is important, even in modern American society. But more than anything else, we try to give a positive view of what the South can offer for America today. And I think that's the key to understanding the Abbeville Institute. So with that said, let's talk about the material we had for the week. Related to culture, most of it. I mean, 3 pieces either on music or Southern literature. And again, that's the positive part of the Southern tradition. As everyone is sitting at home more, of course, many states in the South in particular are starting to loosen up those restrictions. And so people are getting out and about and starting to live their lives again. But certainly, as people still are being cautious, and I think you need to be cautious even when you have to live your life and do things. That would be the case anytime. But we're looking at ways to pass the time, and some of that has to do with music, other literature. And one of the most important literary figures in the South, particularly in the modern South, is Flannery O'Connor. Now, not everyone likes Flannery O'Connor. There are people that think she's overrated. But certainly when you take an American literature course, you're going to get a heavy dose, even today, of Flannery O'Connor. At least you're going to get probably one story or maybe 2 stories by Flannery O'Connor. She is accepted by mainstream literary people as being good. I remember when I took an American literature course in college, it was a winter term, so I had to do an American lit course in 4 weeks. That prepared me for graduate school because it was intense reading. It was on. You read, you read about a book a day, it seemed like. But it was a good class, and we were assigned Flannery O'Connor. And so that was my first exposure to Flannery O'Connor when I was an undergraduate. And I didn't really know much about her, and I think even to this day, the mainstream literature community, and when it comes to literature professors, assign Flannery O'Connor. And of course, she's often described as Southern Gothic. There's much more to her than that. She was Catholic, and so her critique of modernity is fairly interesting. But her appreciation for Southern culture and society, of course, always comes through her work. I don't think you can get around that. And I think that's one reason why we should, even if you're not a big fan of Flannery O'Connor, you should at least support the continual inclusion of Flannery O'Connor in American literature curricula, because she does represent the South, or at least Southern culture and society well. And she was witty, sarcastic in good ways. People didn't always get her humor, and she often said that people read too much into her work. But regardless, I think that when you look at who Flannery O'Connor was, and as a representation of Southern society and Southern culture, she's very good at that. So if you're going to read something, read some Flannery O'Connor. And this particular review was actually published in Law and Liberty. The title is The Graces of Flannery O'Connor. It's a review of a new book, Good Things Out of Nazareth, The Uncollected Letters of Flannery O'Connor and Friends. So it's a collection of letters of her correspondence. And it's covers a whole variety of things. As the review states, it's a goldmine of piercing insight, astute observations, and startling reflections on everything from literature to philosophy to raising peacocks. So, and of course, always with her wit and humor. So, if you're interested in who Flannery O'Connor was, and you're interested in her personality, this would be a good collection to pick up. And I know we have some scholars at the Institute who are very interested in Flannery O'Connor. We've had, Bill Wilson, for example, has done several lectures on Flannery O'Connor for our summer schools. And, of course, all those lectures are free of charge on YouTube or on our website. So you can go out. We did, I think, 3 years in a row, we did summer schools on Southern literature. This is an often forgotten part of the Southern tradition that people need to pay attention to. It's not just talking about secession and again in the war and the political part of the South, but there is no South without a culture. If we're all just some type of amorphous Americans, well, then the South doesn't exist. So having a separate identity and what makes Southern culture unique is very important. Understanding the culture and the people of the South, this is very important stuff. And so I think that's the part of all of this that we need to understand. And of course, music has a lot to do with that. So does Southern poetry and Clyde Wilson's piece. And I'm going to get back to the political stuff in a minute. We're going to do the cultural stuff first. Clyde Wilson's piece, Southern Poets and Poems, Part 5, has some interesting poetry here. It's a homage to revolutionary heroes. And the first poet is Dolly Madison. Now, can anyone imagine Michelle Obama or Melania Trump or the Bushes or any of these quote-unquote first ladies we've had in the last half century sitting down and writing poetry, particularly poetry as good as this piece that Dolly Madison penned on Lafayette? I can't. But Dolly Madison was such an important figure in the early American period. I mean, she lived until 1849. She was kind of the recognized, even after James Madison died, she was the recognized matron of Washington, D.C., and whether that's a good thing or not, but certainly a vivacious woman. I mean, she was often, I think it was Washington Irving described James Madison as a withered little apple John. I mean, this little man walking around that had sometimes humorless. But Dolly Madison was always seen as this vibrant woman who just was the exact opposite of who James Madison was, personality-wise. But she wrote this really interesting poem dedicated to Lafayette, who's, of course, such an integral part of the American experience and was one of the great figures of the American War for Independence. And then, of course, world history. I mean, he's the hero of two worlds. And a lot of people don't realize he took a tour of the United States in the 1820s, spent a lot of time in the South. He was ferried across the Chattahoochee River at one point to get into Alabama, and spent a lot of time in Alabama, then went to Florida. And the Waltons, the Walton family, which, Fort Walton Beach, Florida, that entire area and the Panhandle, spent a lot of time in the Panhandle of Florida. The Walton family had, or at least, had some contact with Lafayette, and it's rumored that Lafayette picked out the location of the capital of Florida, Tallahassee. So, I mean, that's the story. So Lafayette was such an important part of Southern history as well. And then you have, of course, in this particular collection, part of Henry Lee's eulogy of George Washington, first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. He was second to none in the humble and endearing scenes of private life, pious, just, humane, temperate, and sincere, uniform, dignified, and commanding. His example was as edifying to all around him as were the effects of that example lasting. And Washington was the quintessential public American. I think you could say the quintessential American was Daniel Boone. At least that's what everyone thought. I mean, that was the frontiersman. But Washington was also a frontiersman. We forget Washington as teenager spent a lot of time on the frontier as a surveyor and doing things. He was an important part of the fabric of American society beyond politics. And of course, his humility, temperate and sincere, humble and endearing scenes. I mean, the man resigned every commission he could come up with after leading the states to their independence in 1783. And I think that that's something amazing about Washington's character. He could have been king, and he didn't want it. And then, of course, you have Jefferson, who's not considered a poet, but certainly, I mean, he's a literary figure, and his epitaph on his tomb that he wrote doesn't include anything about his high offices in the U.S. government. Here was buried Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of American Independence, the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and the father of the University of Virginia. Nothing about being president, vice president, nothing. Nothing about being governor of Virginia, nothing. It's not about politics. These are the things that Jefferson considered to be his lasting contributions to not just America, but to the world. Education, liberty, independence. So that's an important part of Jefferson and what made him who he was. And I think a much more humble stamp on American society, a Republican stamp, you should say, would be more accurate to say, a Republican stamp. Not your station in life was not defined by the offices you held, but by who you were and what he was able to contribute to society. And then, of course, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, who was of South Carolina. This is his memorial tablet in St. Michael's Church, Charleston. General Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, one of the founders of the American Republic. In war, he was the companion in arms and the friend of Washington. In peace, he enjoyed his unchanging confidence and maintained with enlightened zeal the principles of his administration and of the Constitution. As a statesman, he bequeathed to his country the sentiment, millions for defense, not descent for tribute. As a lawyer, his learning was various and profound, his principles pure, his practice liberal. With all the accomplishments of the gentleman, he combined the virtues of the patriot and the piety of the Christian. His name is recorded in the history of his country, inscribed on the charter of her liberties, and cherished and the affections of her citizens. These are great men and great women in Southern history. And it's important that we remember these people from this period of American independence, not just Southern independence, but American independence. And then, of course, we have also the 5th installment this week of our series on Southern music. And this is a fun series that we're doing. And this particular installment had a lot more Allman Brothers in it because we're getting to the part where we've got a lot of that. But Dwayne Allman, the first piece, Boz Scaggs, as was written in the piece, the title of this particular album should have been The Swampers with Dwayne Allman and Boz Scaggs, because really this was the Muscle Shoals rhythm section and Dwayne Allman with Boz Scaggs with his name on the album. I mean, this is their album, and it's really good. But this particular song, Loan Me a Dime, is it's a blues song, and Boz Scaggs made a name for himself teaming up with Steve Miller from California at one point. But we've got 3 selections from the Allman Brothers Band: Dreams, In Memory of Elizabeth Reed, and Midnight Rider, which are just all great songs. And then we had a little song, Jackson Taylor and the Sinners, which is just a complete defiant song. It's a more modern song. And you look at some of the modern Southern rock acts or country acts, people like Hank 3, for example. I mean, they have a foot in punk rock and then, of course, in country music. And it's, it's very earthy, blue collar, as all country music should be, but, common, and I think is a nice way to put it. And they are certainly defiant when it comes to how they view society and what they think about the modern music scene. Marshall Tucker, Blackfoot, all great Southern rock bands. Chris Stapleton, who's such a big name now. This particular video that we put with Chris Stapleton, Midnight Train to Memphis, which he actually wrote for his band, the Steel Drivers, the bluegrass band, and obviously he's produced it on one of his albums, but it's one of his standards. He plays it everywhere. It's a fun song, but he also has a guest musician on this particular song. You want to go out there and watch it. It's good, and I think this particular song it's the modern incarnation of Johnny Cash's Folsom Prison Blues. I mean, it's just really good. The guest musician is Sturgill Simpson. If you don't know, but he's a kind of an alt country musician now. Sturgill Simpson's really good, but then some Skynyrd. We're getting more Skynyrd, but Charlie Daniels, and one of my favorites on this particular list is this song by Morning Glory. The song Morning Glory by Matt Gaden and Skyboat. Matt Gaden was in Barefoot Jerry. He was in the first Barefoot Jerry. And he left the band after, I think, the first album, which is just a great album. I think it's their best. But then he formed his own band, Skyboat. And this little song, Morning Glory, if you need a little pickup, a little positivity in your life, it's such a great tune for that. I'm just thankful for being where I am, and just a great affirmation of living life. And we also had a Barefoot Jerry tune, You Can't Get Off With Your Shoes On, which is this is I think either the third lineup or second or third lineup of Barefoot Jerry. 1976, I think, is when this came out. Jimmy Colvard was hired from the Nashville A-Team to be part of the band, and the Nashville A-Team was the Nashville version of the Muscle Shoals rhythm section. They were highly sought out studio and session musicians, and some of them were in other bands. I think Chet Atkins was part of that group at one point, the Nashville A-Team. But Chris Cross, Ride Like the Wind, such a great tune. Kind of this. People don't think of Christopher Cross as Southern rock, but he's from Texas, and certainly that Ride Like the Wind has got a great Southern feel to it. And then Pride and Glory, which is Zakk Wylde. So a lot of great stuff here. Missouri Skyline, Mama's Pride, which is a little band out of Missouri back in the 70s. So good stuff. And again, music really helps identify and define the Southern tradition. There isn't really any American music without Southern music. And finally, we had the political pieces. One of them was, or I say political, but one is on the Confederate Supreme Court. Why did the Confederacy not create a Supreme Court? It's in the Confederate Constitution, but I think the answer is simple. They all looked around and saw what happened with the U.S. Supreme Court. They didn't want to go through that, so they didn't create the Confederate Supreme Court. There were bills put forward to do so, and they failed because they thought the states would handle all of this stuff, and that they would be a good vehicle to do it. And of course, Marshall DeRosa, who's one of our scholars, has done a lot of work on the Confederate court system. At some point, I think he has a book. I think he's working on something with the Confederate legal environment, and more importantly, things like slavery. How did the Confederacy deal with slavery in during the war period? I mean, 1861 to 1865, and even before that. I mean, looking at how the South dealt with the issue of slavery and rights of slaves. This is a really interesting topic. But there was no Supreme Court because they didn't want a federal court overriding state court decisions. And they had seen what the U.S. Supreme Court had done to the Constitution. They didn't want a Supreme Court in the Confederacy doing the exact same thing. So no Confederate Supreme Court. And I think Phil Lee does a very good job. There's actually a link in this particular article that I found interesting. It's a journal article, and it's the very first link. It's a journal article about why there wasn't really a Confederate Supreme Court. Click links right to the page where it discusses it. And of course, as Phil Lee gets into, there was always a debate as to the powers of the federal courts. Could it invalidate state law? I mean, what was going on here? Did it have that authority? And I think this is an important point to make. When you look at the original Constitution, you look at how it was argued and all that, during the time period, there were certainly those in the Philadelphia Convention that thought the federal court. The federal courts could invalidate state law, that they would have final say, or I should say invalidate federal law. They would have final say on the constitutionality of federal law. But if any of them thought that there was going to be an invalidation of state law, that was going to happen, and they were open about it, the Constitution would not have been ratified. In fact, when there was either a proposal for a federal negative on state law, a federal veto essentially of state law, John Rutledge said this alone ought to damn the Constitution. So there were certainly those in Philadelphia who thought there should be some type of judicial check on the federal government, but this was split. In states that you generally had judicial review, those states supported it. In states you didn't have it, those states were against it. We know that even John Marshall in the Virginia Ratifying Convention did not think that the federal court system would invalidate state law. And that was always the issue. I mean, this is why Virginia, for example, tried to block the ability of state court decisions to be held in federal court. They passed a law doing it. It was invalidated by Cohens v. Virginia. And John Marshall from Virginia issued that ruling. It was a bad decision. One of the most important decisions in American history that nobody knows about, Cohens v. Virginia. But regardless, we have this no Supreme Court for the Confederate government. And the Confederate Constitution certainly had improvements on the U.S. Constitution. And the fact that it did not create a Confederate Supreme Court, even though it's in the Constitution, was one of those improvements they made in terms of the government itself. And then finally, we had the piece on Monday, and it's a piece on Victor Davis Hanson. Victor Davis Hanson is a quote-unquote conservative, and he uses the pejorative neo-Confederate all the time. He's from California. He really can't stand the South. He thinks anything that talks of nullification or secession, he calls it neo-Confederate because he understands that most Americans have this aversion to the term Confederacy, even though We had the Articles of Confederation, which had a confederacy, and the founding generation used the term confederacy quite often. But no. We can't use that term anymore because it means racism and slavery now. I mean, you just might as well say confederacy equals racism and slavery. If you just use that term. So if you called it the Swiss Confederation, well, I mean, that means that they're all racist and they believe in slavery. So, I mean, this is where we've gotten to with language in the 21st century. But regardless, Yarborough points out that California doesn't have its own skeletons when it comes to things like Jim Crow and segregation. You look at California as a state; they had all of that. But he is certainly in the side that says that secession is treason. He's very critical of California secession. Doesn't want any of that. But his entire position is based on an understanding of the Constitution and of course American history that is at odds with the historical record. He doesn't understand federalism. He doesn't understand the original Constitution. After we wrote this piece, another scholar of ours wrote an email pointing out Hanson's ignorance of even World War II. He doesn't understand World War II, and he's supposed to be a military historian. And this is a guy that teaches at Hillsdale College. And I mean, from all anyone that knows him, I do know some people that know him. He seems to be a nice man, but he is certainly problematic when it comes to understanding the Constitution, American history in general. He's on the right side of some things, but in this particular case, he's on the wrong side of all of this. And that's where the neoconservatives are highly problematic. In fact, they're more problematic than the left because Southerners are generally conservative, and the problem is Southerners tend to listen to mainstream conservatives, and mainstream conservatives are very critical of the South. It's like a Stockholm syndrome that Southerners have. They should just not listen to him, pay attention to him anymore. But we do, and so these neoconservatives do a lot of damage to Southern history and Southern tradition when they do things like Hanson does. It calls it neo-Confederate and racism, slavery. That is problematic when it comes to explaining the Southern tradition, expounding upon the Southern tradition, and using it as an anchor in modern American society. To Hanson, there's nothing important about the Southern tradition. And when you look at what many of these neoconservatives say about things like Reconstruction of the war, the effort was to save the South from itself. And they want to take down Confederate monuments because that would be saving the South from itself. I mean, you're supporting traitors, they would say. So you're saving the South from itself if you take these things down. And they're just, worse than the left. You expect the left to do these things. You expect the woke left to go after Confederate monuments, but they have no power or very little power in the South unless you get willing accomplices like Nikki Haley, who bow to the public pressure at times created by neoconservatives who say that, transplants mostly, who say that these things have to come down. That a statue somehow makes anybody do anything, or a symbol makes anybody do anything. It's just a completely stupid argument. But and I remember a long time ago. I mean, we've got 200 podcasts, and I said that we were talking about congressional hearings, and the question would be raised: what do you think about the Confederate flag or Confederate history? I mean, that's a stupid question. It should be just called that's a stupid question. Why would you ask me? That doesn't have anything to do with what we're talking about here. What a stupid question. But regardless, we've certainly got this particular position of Hanson's. These people are all traitors, and Hanson's got his own. California's got its own issues that are often overlooked. Every state does. Remember, I brought this up with someone from New England. They say, we are going back. We're putting up signs about how bad we were all the time. And this is the Puritan guilt. But more than anything, I think that they're just trying to CYA. If they're going to make the South do it, then they're going to do it. And We're putting up signs at Harvard and Brown and Yale talking about how bad we were back then. So anyways, it's the guilt tour is just in full swing in the United States. And the neoconservatives are helping fuel the fire by not really being conservative on these particular issues and just saying, look, this is American history, leave it alone. Southerners can admire these people, leave them alone. Robert E. Lee, as Booker T. Washington said, and he thought Confederate monuments should go up to the best men in Southern society. It's the best example you can give. So anyways. So we do a lot at the Institute. It's not just politics and criticizing people like Hanson. It's also literature and music and talking about the good things, the positive things that Southern society and Southern culture has to offer modern America. So that's it for this week at the Abbeville Institute. Until next time, good day.